Well, good evening, Professor David. This is Aura O'Connell. Um, I'm going to take a stab at presenting a podcast version, if you will, of the assignment um, to speak on, write about the book of Romans. Um, I just say at the onset of this that it's been incredibly humbling this semester to walk through the book of Romans. In spite of all that we've gone through and all that I've learned and explored, there seems to be so much more. Um, and I'm looking forward to that on my own terms, just continuing to move through the book of Romans. And so tonight, um, I've just been processing and thinking about um, where we are in the world. I think the world seems to be spiraling out of control, or at best away from the principles of God. I always think about our Constitution, that it was founded on Christian principles, and just how far away we've moved from that. Culture says, for instance, that you can and that you should get rid of a baby, and you can do so as late as the last trimester. Even in the state of Michigan, there is no time on when you can or cannot, I should say, abort a baby. Our social media platforms, at any given time, we can see people just annihilating each other with their words, ridiculing one another about, a political stance or some particular stance or party. Um, it's our elections and politicians bear this out. During the Olympics recently, this is what came to mind. Um, During the opening ceremony in Paris, I understand that the LGBT community, with the world watching, chose to recreate what appeared to be the Last Supper, with transgenders and drag queens dressed in attire that appeared to mock what is held to be, the Last Supper, something very sacred to Christians. I thought to myself, God is no stranger to opposition, that mankind has always found a way to oppose the things of God. Since the beginning of time, in fact. So the first Adam and his bride decided in the Garden of Eden to oppose God's will or his word. And there's all this debate about whether that was willfully done because of Satan's strategy, but nevertheless, we have contradictions. And so I thought I might propose yet another contradiction. And this time it's, from the book of Romans, where Apostle Paul says to us from Romans 12:1-2, present yourself a living sacrifice. Now, that's a contradictory phrase, at least for me. Present yourself alive or living, but present yourself a sacrifice, dead. During the time that this was written, a sacrifice was something that was killed. It was something placed on an altar. For instance, Christ was a sacrifice. He died on the cross. We know that Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac. So sacrifices are killed. It's something that is going to die. So Paul says, present your body as a living, dead thing or sacrifice. But how do we do this? How do you present yourself alive and dead at the same time? And Paul helps us out in Galatians 2:20 when he says, I am crucified with Christ. I'm dead. Nevertheless, I live, so I'm alive. Yet not I, because I'm dead, but it's Christ who lives in me, because again, I am alive. So how do you do both? Well, Galatians 2:20 says, the life I now live, I live by faith. I live by faith in the Son of God who loves me and gave himself for me. So In other words, Paul is saying, any plans that I have are now God's plans, or any will that I have is now God's will. Any desires that I have are now God's desires. So, in other words, he's encouraging us to die to self. So we die to self to live for God, choosing God over ourselves. And there's a TV series called The Walking Dead, and to me, that if Paul was around at this time, that title would pretty much sum up what he's saying. Alive to him and dead to self. He says, present your body a living sacrifice. And then he also says in verse 1, present it holy. Now, holy in my mind is different from righteous. Righteous is dealing with this standard between right and wrong. So it's like sinful versus that which is not sinful. So that's righteous. But holy is a unique term reserved just for God. I think back in Genesis where Moses is struggling with going to the children of Israel and saying what God has said. And he says, well, what am I supposed to tell them? Like, what do I tell them? And God says, tell them I am who I am. In other words, there is nobody like him. He is set apart. I think to myself, if someone wanted to find someone like me, they just need look to my neighbor, or to the person in the grocery store. We've got similar features. We probably behave and think alike in some ways, but there is nobody. There is nobody like God. He is unique. And so when he says to be holy, it's as if God is in a category, of course, all by himself. And I thought to myself, you've never heard, at least, people say God is true, 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 or God is mighty, mighty, mighty. But the Bible declares that he is holy, holy, holy. It's like it's to the third power. So holy means to be set apart. It's unique. There's nothing else or no one else like him. In fact, God says to Moses in Genesis, when they ask you, who do you say I am? Just say that I am, right? It's as if God is ultimately putting a no trespassing sign on his character, on who he is. And I thought about this is when I think about holy, I'm reminded of my grandmother's home as a little kid. We had what was called a sitting room. So when people first came, they would go to this space and they would sit in this room, and they took their shoes off in there, and then you progressed to maybe what was called the living room. And in the living room there was pretty decent furniture, and we would sit and drink beverages and have conversations and talk. But then there was the dining room. I mean, the dining room was a spectacular place. We would only peek in there. Nobody really sat in there. The furniture was of a much different quality than the sitting room and the living room. And so I see God as such. He's in a space reserved all by himself, unique, right, untouched. And so the Bible talks about God and holiness. God is likened to this dining room. I guess that's the best way I can say it. He is to be given glory, and this holiness refers to the uniqueness of God. But Paul begs of us to give ourselves, to surrender ourselves to God, and that this is our reasonable service or service of worship. And in my mind, I think that it would be hard to give all of yourself to God without a surrender on your lips and in your heart. That we would have to completely surrender, and that's not like going to church every Sunday. It's not like performing before God, but it's actually communing with God. And so once you give your all to God, there is nothing left to give anywhere else to anyone else. You're surrendering your all. And in my opinion, it's like an oxymoron. In fact, you give all of yourself, you surrender all, only to be filled up again by God, by Him. So Paul then says, be not conformed to the world, but be ye transformed. And so we know, no matter your age now, peer pressure used to be reserved for young people, but at any age nowadays, we can have peer pressure. The world is applying pressure. But wherever God is excluded is actually considered worldly. So I don't believe that God was welcomed on that platform at the opening ceremony for the Olympics. It was a worldly act. And so the world is an exclusion of God. And so there is pressure to conform, to do what culture says, to dress the way that culture says, to react the way that culture reacts, to do the things that God is doing. But we don't have to act like the world or behave like the world, because we've been chosen by God. As a child, I can recall a conversation with my friend's parents. I was about, I don't know, maybe 13 years old. And the conversation actually contradicted what my mom had taught us about respecting adults. And it was around, calling adults by their first name. Now, mind you, I'm from Mississippi. I'm a Southern Belle. And so calling people Mrs. and Mr., and as they say, putting a handle on it was just something that we did. But I went home one evening and I tried calling my mom by her first name. And I'll never forget the look on her face. When I told her where I had gotten this idea, she quickly said, I don't care what they say or what they're doing in their house, right? You're going to do what I say do. Now, I can laugh about that now, but I would imagine this is what God is saying. I've given the word. I've given you what to do. In fact, I've placed my word above my name. So I don't care what the world says. Don't be conformed. Be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind. And then I think to myself, as we think about culture and all that it's saying, media has grasped us. Most young people, research shows, spend an average of 12 to 13 hours, if not more, on some gadget or watching media. And you can't help but think that is somehow transforming the way that they see themselves and the way they see the world. But Paul is reminding us that we should not be conformed to the world, but being transformed by the renewing of our minds. And so the renewing of the mind comes with knowing and understanding and applying the word of God. The world is applying pressure. That's what my mind keeps saying. But you have to stand firm on what we've learned and what we believe. Lastly, I think about a time where my husband and I went to London, and our plan was to visit the Buckingham Fountain. And part of my reasoning or wanting to go to the Buckingham Palace, was because I wanted to see these guards. Like, I've always found it fascinating that they can stand in one spot for hours on end and not move and not blink. And so while there, we could see people go up and take pictures with them. People put their hands some inches away from their faces, and they did not budge. And so as I think about this passage of scripture, not conforming, but being transformed, I think about those soldiers who, despite all the distractions, day in and day out, they don't budge. They don't blink. They don't flinch. I mean, they just don't. And then I thought to myself, part of the reason perhaps that they don't is because they are hired by the palace. They know where they take their marching orders from. And so they don't move. The blinking, the staring, the waving of hands in their faces, people standing literally on their feet, little kids, did not cause them to flinch or to move. And so I would imagine that Apostle Paul is encouraging us to be the same, much like these soldiers at the Buckingham Palace, that despite distractions and all that we're up against in this day and time, that we are to hold firm. We are to stand firm on our convictions, that we are to uphold the things of God.